welcome everybody to our Save Our Shifts Day Shift, episode 8. Today, the topic is modern classic cocktails. I'm your host, Pat McDonald. I'm the education director for USBG Portland, Maine, and one of the producers for Save Our Shifts. I want to welcome you all for joining us today. Today's episode is brought to you by Monkey Shoulder Scotch, which is a really nice full-flavored blended Scotch utilizing 100% malt whiskey from Speyside distilleries. Super smooth, great for mixing, great for classic cocktails indeed. Another sponsor of today's day shift is Hard Shore Gin, great producer of craft spirits from here in Portland, Maine. Hard Shore utilizes a gorgeous blend of 5 botanicals, including Tuscan juniper, mint, rosemary, orris root, and coriander. Really complex flavor profile from a simple botanical build. It's made in small batches and bottled at 92 proof, and we are a big fan of theirs. So thanks to our sponsors today for making this happen. Again, our topic is modern classic cocktails. So we're going to be talking about what exactly that means, modern classics. You know, how did they enter the lexicon of classic cocktails? How's the canon defined? And sort of how has it been influenced and evolved all along? But first of all, I'd like to introduce our panelists today, starting with Mr. John Myers of Big Tree Hospitality. How you doing, John?
Doing well, thank you very much.
I told Zach Bowen, who's the photographer, videographer, who's been helping us out with our night shifts, that I want an autographed copy of the Eventide Cookbook.
I think we can make that happen for you.
Okay. It looks beautiful. I can't wait to get my hands on it.
It's a great book.
So congratulations to you guys.
Thank you.
We also have joining us today Sylvi Roy, bartender of the Portland Hunt and Alpine Club and former president of the Portland USBG. How are you, Sylvi?
I'm great. How are you?
Glad to have you back. Doing well. We also have Bob Herczeg, who's the bar manager of Sir Lee. Nice to see you again, Bob.
Hey, you as well, guys. Good to see all of you.
And last but not least, Mr. Michael Gatlin, tasting room manager of Maine Craft Distilling, and as you can see, one of the owners of Owl and Whale, a producer of bitters, shrubs, and syrups based in Portland, Maine. I like the self-promotion, Mike. Well done. Yeah. Very good. Great. So we might as well jump right into it. I'm going to start out. We're going to talk a little bit about classic cocktails and what that means. So I'm going to essentially attempt to condense 200 years of cocktail culture in the U.S. down to about 1 minute and then move from there. So when we're talking about classic cocktails, we mean drinks that have sort of endured the test of time. You know, drinks that we all think of as foundational knowledge to the bartending craft. And it really started in the early 19th century with the advent of the American cocktail in the 1830s through the 1850s, roughly. Drinks like the Sazerac and the Old Fashioned, you know, slings and fizzes started to come about during that time period. Moving on to the golden age of cocktails, is roughly the 1860s to 1900. Okay, and we're talking about some of the most popular pre-Prohibition bartenders of that era, including Jerry Thomas, Harry Johnson, among them. And they were very prolific creators of some of the modern style cocktails that we all know today. Moving up through the 1920s and the Prohibition era, where things kind of shifted focus from U.S. innovation to Europe. A lot of bartenders moved abroad and you know, held residence at places like the Savoy Cocktail Bar in London, where Harry Craddock was a prolific author of drinks. Then sort of moving back to the U.S. in the early 1930s and 1940s, we have the whole Polynesian culture of Tiki cocktails that entered the canon then. Bit of a drought from the 1950s through the 1970s. The post-war slump, as we'll call it, people were drinking Jai martinis, skewing vermouth, you know, whiskey highballs, things like that. Up to the 1980s and 90s, what I call the cocktails and dreams era. Okay, I think TGI Fridays, but some innovative, fun things were happening at places like the Rainbow Room in New York, headed up by Dale DeGroff. And then moving into the cocktail renaissance. Okay, so this is really where our conversation becomes relevant. So post 2000, a lot of things happening in the New York scene and places like San Francisco and Seattle. And that's where a lot of the cocktails we'll be speaking about today come from, is that post 2000 renaissance. So my first question today, now that we've summed that up, goes to Bob. And when someone says classic cocktail, not quite modern classic, but classic cocktail, foundational cocktails, what kind of drinks come to mind for you?
I mean, for me, I normally think definitely spirit forward. Even if it's a citrus-based drink, some sort of sour or something like that, or a daisy or whatever, I still think like you're taking the base spirit as the main thing that you're going to be tasting. So if we're talking about like a daisy, for instance, that's a margarita. If you're thinking about something in kind of the martini or even Manhattan category, if you go far back enough, they're pretty related. You're thinking, gin or bourbon or rye being the dominant flavor, and then everything else kind of being used as a modifier or an additional flavor to it. That's kind of where I think, if you're talking about classic cocktails, that's kind of where I tend to go.
So Bob, I'm curious, and give me an example of a classic cocktail that your build, whether it's the recipe or technique, has sort of evolved over the years or changed. And I'll use the example, hope I'm not stealing this one from you, of an old fashioned. Because when I started bartending in the early 2000s, it was a muddled drink. It had a cherry, it had an orange, people were putting club soda in them, like very different than the spirit forward drink you kind of mentioned today. And feel free to use that example as well.
I mean, yeah, it's the exact same thing. I think any of us who has started a while ago, I mean, my first bartending job was under a bunch of people who had been bartending in the 70s and 80s. So they all made it that way. And, it was a giant wedge of orange and a bright red maraschino cherry and a packet of sugar with some soda water and bitters and Seagram 7 probably. Yeah. I would say the thing that is more of a technique thing than an alcohol thing was when I first started stirring versus shaking. When I first started, you shook everything. You shook martinis, you shook Manhattans. And when I first read about stirring, I was a little skeptical. I was like, it's not gonna make a big deal. And I made two side by side, and I was just like, oh, okay, this is real. This is like, it definitely makes a big difference in not just what you're using, but the technique you use and how to make something. And if you go back to the very old, books or the original ways of doing things, you see that there's a reason that it's described that way in those books.
Is anybody still using Rose's lime juice in their gimlets? When John Golden's not in the house?
Only when John Golden's around.
That's a good point. So I'm curious, about this kind of foundational knowledge that we all have and consider, and where it comes from specifically, and whether it's recipes or techniques. Kind of want to figure out like how people learn what they learned. And I'm going to direct this question to John. Did you have any mentors early on in your career that had a significant influence on your current knowledge?
I would say at the very start of my career, I worked under, people who had been bartenders in the 70s and 80s, and I learned a lot of things that I had to unlearn later. I don't think that I actually used vermouth in my Manhattans and martinis for the first few years that I bartended, because that just wasn't how we did it. But then definitely, I think Roxanne Dragon, who was the bartender at Hugo's when I first started there about 9 years ago, Arlen, who's one of the owners of Big Tree now, those were two people who definitely guided me in the right direction, that taught me, that drinks were more than just the base spirit, and then the importance of fresh ingredients and fresh juices and homemade syrups, and then I think from there you take to the internet and you get into cocktail books, and that's sort of how you learn how to do it right.
Yeah. There were definitely some cocktail books early in my career that were influential, but I was lucky to have some good mentors as well. But I remember like having a copy of Mr. Boston behind the bar, more as like a reference, and all these like antiquated recipes that nobody ever asked for. It was more of like a reference, like alphabetical, and it's since been updated. Actually, Jonathan Pogash, the USBG did the 75th anniversary edition, and it's a great book for any of you out there who are looking for sort of a reference guide. I think obviously, many of us did not go to bartending school to learn the classics, and we kind of did it through trial and error and a lot of different required reading, which brings me to my next question. And this one's for Sylvi. What types of books would you recommend for new bartenders who are getting into the craft, both for foundational knowledge and or history or even contemporary cocktails?
So a book that the owner, Andrew Bolt, the owner of Alpine, gave me when I started here is the Bar Book, written by Jeffrey Morgenthaler, which honestly, it's like my Bible. I think it's a wonderful book for anybody if you've been in the industry for 10, 15, or a year, or however many years. It will bring you back to a lot of the basics and how to jump off with bartending at home or bartending in general. And it hits a lot of points that I don't know. I love the way he wrote it. It's very funny. It's very easy to read and hits pretty much everything from tools to use to ice to use to why you shake and stir. And it's a great thing for people who have been bartending or who want to learn how to bartend. That's kind of my go-to. I go back there for classic recipes all the time.
It's a great book, and it's one of those that, like, a lot of books you pick up and they have beautiful pictures and they're great recipes and like well designed, but like they're almost not the greatest things to like actually read through cover to cover. And I think the Bar Book is a great example of one that is very readable and very approachable, and
it keeps you entertained through the whole thing.
Yeah.
While you're also like going back to basics but like learning new things and maybe stepping out of bad habits that you've had in the past. That explains why in a proper way.
So one of the books that I really enjoyed early in my career in terms of sort of categorizing your frame of mind about drinks was Gary Regan's Joy of Mixology. They've done an updated version of it, but it really helped me to like make a lot of different connections between different styles of drinks, because if you're looking at like the whole like broad spectrum of classic cocktails, just from like an individual memorization standpoint, it's like daunting because there's just hundreds of recipes. But once you start to group them together and see that they're very often slight variations on one another, it becomes a little bit easier. And I think a great resource as well is the book by the guys from Death & Co., the Cocktail Codex. Kind of break everything down into 6 root drinks and all the derivatives that kind of happen there. Cool. So I think if anybody else has some insights into some of their favorite books, I'd be happy to hear about those.
One of my favorites was, I remember the first time looking through the PDT cocktail book, and I just, the inspiration that came from that and the directions for setting up a bar and, sort of what you're looking for and how they approach service at PDT. I always appreciated that.
I really like all the artwork in PDT.
Yeah.
Super fun.
Super fun.
And his rules, bar rules.
Yeah, the bar rules. Yeah.
Very important stuff. They don't teach you that everywhere.
They don't.
I'd also throw out there the Smuggler's Cove book. If you're interested in getting into tiki stuff, it's pretty much, I don't know, I can't think of anything better to get started with.
I think Dale DeGroff's book is pretty awesome too, especially as an introduction to classic cocktails.
You mean the craft of the cocktail or essential cocktail?
No, the craft, where he knows all the stories of Harry Nielsen and how bartending was in the late 70s in California, and the way his approach towards treating a drink, with respect to fresh squeezed juices, just elevating the whole game. I think a lot of respect goes to that man for modern cocktails.
Definitely. Well, this is perfect timing for a little midway break where I like to thank our sponsors again. Monkey Shoulder Scotch, a gorgeous blend, perfect for mixing of all malt whiskey from Speyside. Thank you, Monkey Shoulder, as well as Hardshore Gin from here in Portland, Maine. Gorgeous craft gin bottled at 92 proof with a very complex flavor profile from a simple botanical blend of Tuscan juniper, orris root, coriander, mint, and rosemary. Big fans of those, and they both work great in a variety of modern plastics. So now that we've sort of covered some of the OG classics, I want to jump right in and let's talk about some modern classics. So I'm just going to use the example of the Last Word cocktail because this is a really good example of a drink that comes from a historical era. It actually comes from the 1920s at the Detroit Athletic Club. So during Prohibition, this drink was created, but it lived in relative obscurity for most of the 20th century. I think it was published in Ted Saussure's Bottoms Up in the 1950s. It was in 2004 when Murray Stenson from the Zigzag Cafe kind of discovered this 4 equal parts build of gin, maraschino, chartreuse, and lime juice. And this spurred a lot of imitators for some of the modern classics that we know today. So this one goes out to Mike Gatlin. And what's a modern classic, whether it's a derivative of the Last Word or not, do you think every bartender should know?
The two that spring to my mind, first off the Last Word, is the Naked and Famous from the Death and Co book, which is mezcal, lime, yellow chartreuse, and Aperol. I made one just last night for 2 guys who just wanted anything mezcal. I just happened to have all those ingredients in front of me and whipped it up, and they couldn't have been more happy. The second one I'd like to talk about is the industry sour. When I was coming up in my own bar in New York in the early 2000s, we would do shots, equal parts Fernet Branca and green chartreuse. And it never occurred to me to turn that into a cocktail. I don't know why, but Ted Kilgore in St. Louis did that. Made the sour, and everybody I turned that drink on to it just hits the right spot. I mean, there's 200 something ingredients in that sucker, but it's so good. Also an equal parts drink. Also 0.75 times 4 cocktail.
So in addition to the Fernet and chartreuse, what else are we talking about?
It's lime juice and simple syrup.
Yeah, that is a good one. Definitely
Super
a bolder
easy.
flavor.
No, most bars have those ingredients. It's a cocktail you can order anywhere because most bars are going to have those ingredients. You know, if you don't have green chartreuse, it's a shot in a beer. So
I'd like to kind of treat this one like a round table and stay on the topic of modern classics for a little while. Bob, what's a modern classic you think every bartender should know?
I feel like I'm gonna steal this one from everybody else, but definitely a penicillin. I mean, especially if we're talking modern and not rooted in something else. I mean, which for anybody who doesn't know, Scotch, a ginger honey syrup, lemon juice, a little bit more smoky Scotch on top. So like, I mean, a great example, our sponsor, Monkey Shoulder, would be great in this with another smoky item on top. And then a variation of that, which is from, if we're talking kind of going back to cocktail books, A Spot at the Bar, which is from Australia. They have a variation called Son of a Bee Sting, which is with gin instead of Scotch and rose water instead of a smokier Islay Scotch on top, and is a really delightful summer drink, and changes again with like every kind of different gin you would put in it, whether it's something like Hardshore, which is going to be botanical and a little bit malty, or if you go with a traditional London Dry, or whatever you have in the house will work. Also a really killer drink.
So what was the name of that drink you just mentioned that's a riff on the penicillin?
It's called A Son of a Bee Sting.
Son of a Bee Sting. That's interesting because that almost goes full circle with this drink, because as I understand it, the penicillin is actually a riff on a Gold Rush, which itself is a riff on a bee's knees cocktail.
But
so
I mean,
there
it
are
all
always those
exactly
like, connections. It's coming
totally
right back around for that one. John, you're up next. What's a modern classic that you love to make?
Modern. Well, I was just thinking of one. I was thinking about the PDT's cocktail book, and that had me thinking about the Benton's Old Fashioned from the PDT's book, which is, it's a classic cocktail, but made in a way that it was, very different. And I think that was like the first, popular fat washed cocktail out there. So that's, that's bourbon fat washed with bacon fat, and they sub in maple syrup for the sugar content. And I remember, tasting that for the first time. And I think that's a truly modern classic. It's a classic cocktail that has been modernized. And then that technique of fat washing from there has, been applied in many different ways. So,
yeah. I mean, who here hasn't tried a bacon wash old fashioned? I think we've all done it. Yeah.
I remember that year that I had it for the first time. I think for Christmas that year, every one of my Christmas lists got a little bottle of fat washed bourbon. It was like, all right, done.
Nice. Yeah. It is good. That's, there's another classic cocktail that's sort of in that realm of like breakfasty drinks, and that's the breakfast martini. One that I really loved. It actually came out of the 1990s, Salvatore Calabrese from the Liberty Bar in London, and that was done with gin. Hard Shore would be a great one for that. Cointreau, fresh lemon, and orange marmalade.
Yeah,
that kind of like has that nice kind of like bitter component to it as well. Obviously, you need a double strainer for that one, but it's definitely another breakfast-oriented drink. I'm sure we can all agree that we've seen many variations of those. And it's too bad Sylvi dropped off, because I'd love to ask her about the espresso martini they do at Hunt and Alpine. I think it's a rum-based one with Allen's coffee brandy and cold brew or espresso in there. But it's delicious. If you guys are at Hunt and Alpine, definitely don't skip the espresso martini. Any variations, I guess, on the Negroni nowadays, especially with mezcal? And I know you had mentioned some mezcal drinks before, but that Oaxacan kind of realm of whether it's a Negroni or an old fashioned. Mezcal definitely, obviously, is trending up and has been for a while now. But a lot of times I get guests in my bar who are just saying, make me something with mezcal, anything. So, what are some modern classics with mezcal? And I'll open this up to anybody to jump right in that you guys like to make.
I'm thinking about the Oaxacan old fashioned, but that's not a mezcal cocktail. That is that's tequila, right?
So it's
50-50.
usually a combo of mezcal and tequila.
Yeah.
Like a split base.
Split base and I think mole bitters in there. That was that's what you actually get calls for sometime. That I think is evolved as a modern classic tequila mezcal based, for sure.
One of the ones that I've been fooling around with, my girlfriend really likes it, so I've been making it a lot during quarantine, is a variation on Joy Division, which is from Death & Co. And that's gin, Cointreau, dry vermouth, and a dash of absinthe, but subbing in mezcal or tequila for the gin is very, very tasty.
Another one I really love is the Trinidad Sour. That, utilizes a pretty heavy dose, about an ounce or an ounce and a half of Angostura bitters that most people didn't think of as like a primary build, but it's certainly strong enough and full flavored and kind of subs in for like another type of Amaro. Sylvi, glad to have you back. No, it's okay.
My iPad just shut off.
That's all right. Wanted to give you a chance to add to the
espresso martini.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about the espresso martini at Hunt and Alpine and sort of where the inspiration for that comes from.
So we use Canon Coffee, which is a wonderful local coffee roaster that we adore, and they make a really nice dark roast for us that's highly acidic. It adds some body to the cocktail, and then we use plantation 3-star rum. And our good old Maine #1 selling spirit for a while, Allen's Coffee.
Nice.
It's very simple, but it truly is the best martini I've ever had. And before I was here, I would do, you get espresso from the machine and you chill it, and then you put Baileys and all these sweet things. But our espresso martini is balanced so that it has some sweetness. But it, as the menu says, it'll wake you up and fuck you up.
Nice.
Delicious.
So one thing that I wanted to touch on a little bit, and I think we have time, is how the whole kind of revival of tiki cocktails has influenced the modern canon. I mean, I think most of us, even until probably very recently, within the past maybe 5 to 7 years, more experienced tiki cocktails in Asian restaurants for the most part, and rarely actually had been to a proper tiki bar. But nowadays, a lot of us not only know how to make proper tiki drinks, but have them on our menus, even if it's not a tiki bar. So how has the tiki revolution, if you will, influenced the lexicon of modern classics? And John, I want to direct this one to you because I know you guys have some great tiki drinks on the menu at Eventide.
I would say that the tiki revival has influenced modern classics just because it kind of provides a whole nother flavor palette that you're able to draw from, and a whole nother set of ingredients that you can pull in when you're making cocktails. So, having orgeat on hand, having falernum, and having a, broad variety of different syrups and juices, I think really contributes to making interesting drinks. And it's just a whole nother flavor profile with warm spices and, acid from citrus. And I think it's, done a lot for just bringing new different ingredients to the table, and also for sort of complicating drinks. Tiki drinks are known for having not the shortest ingredient list, and I think that it makes it so you're not afraid to combine a lot of different things in one glass.
So Mike, you're over at Maine Craft Distilling, which actually hosted the USBG Portland first annual Tiki Shake-Off.
That's right.
Yeah, first year. That was probably at least 6 years ago now.
I remember.
Unfortunately, we had to postpone that this spring, but hopefully we'll be getting back to that soon enough. Mike, do you have any tiki drinks on your menu at Maine Craft?
I have some. Actually, one. Right now, the current menu, we like to theme it out, and right now it's sort of COVID inspired.
Okay.
We're paying tribute to a lot of people who have passed on this year. One drink is called Little Richard, and it's named that because tutti frutti. And so it's spiced rum and guava and pineapple and lime and ginger. And that's definitely a tiki-based, thought process that goes into that sort of cocktail making. Same with the slushy machines. I have prickly pear coconut slushies that I don't think I would have attempted without some type of tiki background from rum and all the events that we've done together. My favorite current cocktail, not on this menu, but I've been consulting and writing other menus, is a Scotch-based tiki cocktail, because I'm trying to sort of stretch the mind and the palate as most as I can. Growing up, I remember a friend of mine, a friend of my mother's, who drank Scotch so much and worried so much he had ulcers, so he drank Scotch and milk. Which I always thought was very bizarre. And then I saw someone else do it recently, and I'm like, man, that maybe there's a thing there. So I did a monkey shoulder cocktail with mango coconut milk and lemon juice and yellow chartreuse, and just the depth and complexity of a tiki thought process, stepping outside of the rum and going with some of the richness of the Scotch, turned out really amazing.
Cool. Sounds good.
Definitely.
Yeah.
One of those often riffed upon, I think, tiki modern classics would be the Jungle Bird. One that we often see with the blackstrap rum and Campari, pineapple, and fresh lime. That's one that I actually riffed on at Central Provisions back in the day. It was pretty popular. Has anybody else taken classic tiki cocktails and sort of personalized them for more of a contemporary feel?
Speaking of the Jungle Bird, we had one that we've been selling to go in our to-go cocktails called the T-Bird. So it was a tequila-based Jungle Bird riff that we ended up putting. We didn't use blackstrap, but we ended up adding a little bit of sfumato to it, which is a really nice, like bitter, smoky amaro that added that kind of like dark depth to it, but with that, with pineapple and Campari and lime, and it was a really nice riff off of the classic.
Nice. Bob, I got a quick minute because I know you have some tiki drinks on your menu there. Before we move into our closing segment, what's a great tiki modern classic we can find at Sir Late?
We have a couple on right now. The one I really like is called Time for Heroes, and it's a gin drink. It's gin, lime juice, lime sherbet, and some absinthe as well. It sounds not particularly crazy, but once you have it, I don't know. It was a mistake, honestly. I made the wrong drink in a tin, and I was like, didn't want to throw it away, and I kind of fiddled with it until it came out, and then I was like, okay, hold on, this can work. And I think maybe my favorite drink on the menu right now. It's really tasty, and I think people normally do think just rum when they are typically thinking of a tiki drink. So it's nice to kind of throw a little curveball at them in that way.
All right, so we're getting near the end. I just want to first of all thank our sponsors again, Monkey Shoulder Scotch and Hard Shore Gin from Portland, Maine, for helping us produce this Day Shift episode number 8. We do have a final segment that we like to do that was started by our regular host, Mark Hibbard. He calls What's Good Here? So the idea behind that is a guest comes into your bar, you hand them a menu, they're not interested. They want to talk to the bartender and get your full attention. And maybe they don't have the best knowledge of modern classics, but let's try and give them a little lesson in the modern classics. So we'll go around the room, starting with Mike Gatlin. What's good here?
My favorite cocktail on the menu right now is the Roy Horn, named after the Siegfried and Roy couple who passed this year. And it's a riff on a whiskey sour, uses Maine Craft Distilling's 50 Stone, green chartreuse, lemon juice, and basil honey syrup. It's super fantastic, refreshing, and you don't need more than a few.
Nice. It's funny because I think we've all been stumped before from different orders and bars, and people see a drink on another menu. So this one is for John. Can you make me a Chinese 88?
Oh, goodness. I mean, now I can. Yes, definitely. Because I learned recently that the Chinese 88 is just a French 75, but at P.F. Chang's. But I might direct you somewhere else,
Okay.
Try to broaden your horizons a little bit.
All right. So what's good here then?
What's good here? Well, I think this time of year, there's a cocktail that's been on the menu at Eventide for a while. And actually, recently, once Hard Shore came on the scene, we updated it to include Hard Shore Gin. And it's our take on a Negroni Bianco. So it's a white Negroni made with Hard Shore Gin, Coqui Americano, and Dolan Blanc Vermouth. And, arguably, it's improved. I would say maybe not arguably, since we switched over to Hard Shore, it's really made that cocktail come alive with that botanical blend. So I would say this time of year, sitting outside, warm summer day, nice light take on the white Negroni.
Awesome. All right, Sylvi, you're next up. What's good here?
So I'm gonna say that our Rain Killer, which is a riff on a classic painkiller, which is a nice tiki style blended cocktail, but the Rain Killer is essentially a clarified kind of version of a painkiller. So we do a coconut washed rum with lime cordial, pineapple, fresh made pineapple demerara syrup, orange bitters. We like to serve it over crushed ice, but that one is like summer in a glass. It's so delicious.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
All right, and for our final entry of what's good here, Bob, what's good here?
If we're sticking to kind of classics, we do we try to always have like a low alc option on the menu, even though we have kind of a short menu. So we have a cobbler on now that we're calling a Swedish cobbler, and that's some Amontillado sherry, some Swedish punch, which is like a almond and spice syrup, and some burlesque bitters, and that comes with a bunch of crushed ice and some mint on top and some grated lime zest, and it's just nice and refreshing and kind of has some nice spice, cool flavors to it, a little bit nutty, and it's good on a hot day.
Fantastic. Well, you guys just made me pretty thirsty, so I'm gonna go refill my coffee cup, I guess. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thanks to our panelists and our sponsors for making the day shifts happen. I'm your host, Pat McDonald. Glad to have you with us. Cheers.